So welcome to year 2 of the Anthropocene Architecture School. This is workshop number 22, and we're going to try and double that by the end of the year. So last year was quite a kind of reactionary and responding to kind of the sense of crisis, and this year we're going to do things just a little bit differently. So the theme for year 2 is disaster collectivism. So this is a really nice concept I picked up on an activist retreat, and this is the antithesis of disaster capitalism. It's the sort of things that we need to do if we want to kind of respond to that in a really proactive and kind of progressive sense as well. So the purpose of this series, the kind of the reimagine session, is to show you people who have, instead of leaving ideas just as ideas, have taken them and put them into action and given us precedents for doing amazing things even in times of crisis. So we will have a Q&A, but at the same time, we're going to gently facilitate that just to give everyone some space. So the kind of ground rules for the Q&A as it kicks in, we'll be picking up any questions that you have throughout the kind of session. So drop them in the chat box and say if you would like to ask it yourself or you would like one of us to ask for you. We're going to give everyone that kind of option. This is also the Zoom equivalent of running around with a microphone, so things will not be instantaneous. So please do give us this little slightest bit of slack. And we're going to be mindful and respectful of everybody else. So when you ask a question, please don't use that as an opportunity to ask 5 questions at once, just to make sure as many people as possible can have their time to speak. So without further ado, I don't need to give an introduction because we're going to get a story instead. So I will stop sharing my screen and Krista can take over and introduce yourselves, and it's time for telling the story instead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for having me and for being here to listen to the story of the Better Block. I'm excited to see what questions you have and see if there, I know there are a lot of things that are different between, working here in the US and where you all are. But I think there are a lot of lessons learned that can apply to anyone. So I will jump right in and get going. Can you all see my screen?
Yep, far away.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I'm Krista. I'm the managing director of the Better Block, which is an urban design nonprofit based out of Dallas, Texas. Our work started on the street right here when our founding director, Jason Roberts, walked out onto this with his neighbors, and they asked what could be done to make it better. A lot of them wanted to add cafe seating, put some flowers in the space, and just create an area where people could come be together. They quickly learned that there are ordinances from the 40s here in Dallas that prohibit those things from happening. So if you want to add street cafes, it's area times market value times 85% times 12%. We don't know what that means. And if you want to add flowers, it's $1,000. And then our favorite one is the one under crowds, which basically says it's illegal for crowds to gather on a sidewalk. So if you want to kill street life, that's what you do. So they took a look at these things and they said, well, we can't do the things we know we want to legally. So what would happen if we just kind of took over our street for a weekend? And so that's what they did. They painted bike lanes with kids paint and duct tape because they knew they could wash it away pretty quickly and easily. They rented some old lighting and they created seating and basically invited the neighborhood to come out and be a part of this space. They had some friends here who wanted to do an art store and some friends over here who also had a similar concept. They paired them together and put them in a space and said, see what happens. And then they printed out those ordinances that they were breaking and they posted them in the windows and they invited City Hall to come take a look. City Hall said, you're right, some of this doesn't make sense. We need to work to change some of these policies. And it took some time, but they eventually got the sidewalk cafe fees lowered. So this was all kind of the beginning of tactical urbanism. It was especially, the concept was especially new here in Dallas, where people hadn't really seen neighbors go out and make the changes that they wanted to see in their own neighborhood. So Jason then started thinking about some other ways in which he can make some changes. So he started studying these old maps of Dallas and saw that wherever there was a good form and the buildings were kind of clustered and it was a little more walkable, he saw these old dark lines running by these buildings. And he couldn't quite figure out what was going on. So he did some research and he realized that that was the old streetcar line, which had since been removed. So he started studying it and he thought about, well, what would happen if we brought the streetcar back to this neighborhood? What could that do? So his background is in IT. And so late one night he was bored and he decided to put up a website. He called it the Oak Cliff Transit Authority. As you can see, there's a board, there's news. He pulled some photos from, inspiration around the world, and he launched this site. A few days later, the Dallas Morning News wrote about this group of people who were planning the return of the streetcar. There was no group, there was nothing but a website. However, that led to them applying for a Tiger grant and getting $43 million and getting the streetcar implemented. And basically they implemented it from downtown to Jason's neighborhood in Oak Cliff. There's a bridge between the two, and literally they just bridged that divide. And that was about 8 years ago, and there's been a huge amount of development happening along that line, whereas before there was nothing going on. So Jason started talking about the work that he was doing and this concept of just neighbors going out and making things happen. He open sourced a lot of his ideas, put recipes online for building your own Better Block, and that allowed the concept of the Better Block to spread around the country and around the world. So we are now in this old car garage in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. We're halfway between the very first Better Block and the streetcar. And we've got a workshop here, and this is basically where we kind of sit around dreaming up big ideas. We have done so much work alongside cities these days that sometimes it's asked, are we too sanctioned? And I would argue that that's not possible. The whole point of tactical urbanism was to get City Hall to listen to the neighbors and to see what changes they wanted to make and get them to start making these changes. The fact that cities are now bringing us in to do this work and to do this community engagement, I think means that they're paying more attention. So, hold on, sorry. So to give you an idea of some of the work, here are a few of our projects. The first one I'm going to talk about is in the North Hill neighborhood of Akron, Ohio. This is kind of a typical project for us. We will go onto a street. It's often overbuilt. The priority is definitely on the car instead of the people. There's commercial around it, and then there's residential around that. The residential is important because our projects do not work if the community is not involved. We work alongside communities, not for and not to communities. And that is a big part of how we approach the work. And it's always with a listen first, design second mentality. So we'll look at this neighborhood, we'll do surveys, we'll ask what's working, what's not working. And then over the course of 90 to 120 days, we'll turn it into this. This is temporary in this case. In fact, it rained later that night, so those bike lanes washed away. But what it did is it showed the community, you already have the tools and the resources, you have the designs and the plans. You can go out and you can make these changes. But it also shows City Hall, here's how these changes do or don't work in this space. How can you work now with the neighborhood to make these things more permanent? We often look at a lot of empty lots and think about what could these lots be. We'll work with neighbors to kind of reimagine them, and in the course of a couple hours we can create plazas and spaces. We did a project in Macon, Georgia, where we created the world's largest pop-up bike network with volunteers. And I like this photo because we generally say you can break any rule as long as you're wearing a bright vest. So these are our volunteers out here demonstrating what that looks like. This is kind of just a look at a simple intersection change that we'll work on. What was great about this project is it is outside of Akron, Ohio, where that last project was. And so they kind of knew what Better Block was, they knew what was going to happen. So the city actually came out and repaved the road before the project had even happened. So the community could see that changes were coming even before a project was even in place. Sorry. And then that led us to launching this concept of Wikiblock. Wikiblock is an online library of street furniture designs that anyone, anywhere can download for free. You can cut them out using a CNC router. I think most of you know what that is, but I basically say it's like a giant printer for wood. They are generally found in maker spaces, they're found at colleges, cabinet makers use them. They're a lot more readily available than you might think. And then once you cut these elements out, you can build them without any glue, screws, or nails. So what this allowed us to do was kind of raise the design aesthetic of tactical urbanism approaches, but still allow for that community build element, which is vitally important in building spaces with neighborhoods. So an example of some of those designs, we usually use cafe seating in our projects because we want to activate the storefronts. We want to help out local entrepreneurs and let them test out their concepts. So you can get 2 chairs and 1 table on 1 4x8 sheet of plywood. We look at bus designs and bus attachments and how can we make those more readily available. Again, working with entrepreneurs on kiosks and what can make things a little bit easier when doing farmers markets, things like that. And then we address issues that are happening in the city. So when Bike Share came to town, I was super excited, loved the concept, loved it. As we all know, not everyone did. And there were things that happened. But what it did is it showed us that we didn't have the infrastructure that we needed to be able to support the bikes that were coming to town. Not only did we not have the bike lanes, but we also just didn't have the parking. So one of our first things we did was create this parklet. I'm sure all of you know the parklet. The idea is that it can take up the space of a parking spot, but rethink it for people. So in this particular design, you've got spaces for people to sit waiting for public transit or ride share. But then we also have places where you can park bikes or scooters. And then we also have a little shade element over on the other end. So this is online. If you wanted to, you could download the design this evening and you could go out and put it out on the street tomorrow. We also like to challenge ourselves and do things that are a little weird. Wisconsin has a cheese board, and they wanted to they were going to South by Southwest, this was 2 years ago. They wanted to do the world's largest cheese board, and they wanted it to be housed in a barn, which had to fit the very specific measurements of this room that they were going to be in. So I believe that the barn ended up being 48 feet long. At some points it was 10 feet high, at other points it was 12 feet high. But they reached out to us and they asked if this was something that we could possibly do. We weren't sure that we couldn't, so we decided to give it a try. So this was the night before South by and before the 200 pounds of cheese came, and we were just nervous about whether or not we could pull it off. And then this is kind of what it ended up looking like. This is actually a Guinness World Record holder, so if you want to look it up, we do have the world's largest cheese board. But like I was mentioning earlier, our beginning approaches was really kind of reusing pallets and things like that to create new spaces. But with WikiBlock, we can kind of elevate that design and create these spaces alongside the neighborhood. And it allows us to work in places like Duluth, Minnesota, and parking lots like this, where there's not much there. It needs the edge to be better defined. It needs a place for people to come together. This was also in November, so it needed a little bit of warmth and a glow to it. And this is what we ended up creating alongside the community. Over on the left-hand side, you can kind of see the structure. This was rethinking the old, the train station and creating a space that not only could be for bikes or for people waiting, but on the edges there, you can see people are vending from that. So it became a marketplace as well. We recently worked on a project in Akron. So we did the first couple projects there, and we learned a lot about the neighborhood. And we found that in North Hill, there's a large Bhutanese refugee population. And so we purchased this house that you see here. It was about, I think, $23,000 or something ridiculously low. And we renovated it. And we wanted to create a community space on the bottom floor where people could come together for a variety of meetings and different things that may be happening in the area. But on the second floor, we renovated the space into 3 bedrooms that we rented out on Airbnb. That kind of helped us offset the operating cost of the project. And then the backyard had a parking lot that was quite massive. And so we rethought half that space into a park that the community could use, again, for events or gatherings, or even just as a space to be. So this project was supposed to be an 18-month project. We learned a lot in that 18 months, and we learned that 18 months was not long enough. So it ended up going on for 3 years. But in December, we officially handed it over to the community, and they are now operating this 100% without us, and it's a really beautiful space in Akron. We recently worked on a shopping center. These are rampant in our part of the world, and people don't really know what to do with them as they become vacant. So in this particular case, the property owner would like to think of something different to do, but they didn't think the community cared. And you can kind of see what the community turned the space into. And we're quite high and it's very spread out, but there were thousands of people there who wanted to show that this space could be something different and that they did care and they wanted to turn it into something much more vibrant. We also worked in Toronto last year. We did Canada's first ever pop-up Vision Zero project. So with this one, there was a private donor whose friend was killed while biking on the street. And she reached out and said, I want to make this a conversation piece. I want people to know that this is happening and that we're not doing enough. So in this case, you can kind of see here on the bottom, what we ended up doing was we took away a lane, we extended this sidewalk, and then we introduced a bike lane, a buffered protected bike lane along this whole stretch. The stereotype is that Canadians are always very kind. That was not the case in this. We definitely learned that when you take away parking, you're going to hear about it. So it was really interesting, but the thing that we learned from this and the other design option that we had proposed, but it was shot down for whatever reason, and is an easy fix, is instead of this extension of the sidewalk, just do the bike lane there and do the buffer with cars. So you can still have the parking and you can have the protected bike lane. So that is part of the conversation now, and it is definitely still going on a year later. And it is part of what people are thinking about as they're looking at this street and what it could look like. And that's kind of an on-the-ground view of it. We also worked on a project in West Allis, Wisconsin. And again, a lot of times when we're doing these things, we're looking at how are we making it safer for pedestrians? How are we kind of shifting the priority from the vehicle to the person? So a lot of that is by looking at intersections and creating more dynamic, safer spaces, extending the pedestrian space so that they have a shorter distance to walk, and slowing down the vehicles that are in that space. We often are bringing in play elements for kids. In this case, we're looking at a really natural playscape and trying to introduce a little more of those concepts in the space. This one was looking at a drainage ditch. All the buildings in this area were turned away from the drainage ditch, and people literally used their lunch times and they would walk around the parking lot. And it's hot here. It's just, there was nothing, and it was quite sad. So it's like, okay, instead of turning our backs to the drainage ditch, how can we make it a part of what the space is and design something for it? So we built a couple bridges and then created trails and created a space where people could come out and engage with it rather than turning away from it. And then this project is more focused on how can you design a space that makes it safer for kids. So this is in Dallas. This is one of our more diverse neighborhoods. There are about 180 languages spoken at the school that's in the left-hand corner. You can't see it right there. So there's a school right here, and then there's a ton of apartment buildings over on this side, and the kids are walking to and from that school. That walk is terribly dangerous. There's a lot of shootings that are happening, drug deals, different things like that that have happened in this space to where parents don't want their kids to go to the school because they don't want them to make that walk. So we started looking at this area and thinking about like, what can we do to make it safer? So we introduced lighting, trees, color. We took away some of the right-hand turns on this road and basically created a space that would be more inviting for people to come to. And this is what that turned into. So as you can see, the yellow right here, that's where we took away that turn and we took away that turn. This was 8 months ago, maybe 10 months ago. And no negative feedback from those being taken away at this point. We created a stage because the community wanted a place to perform and to be out there. We created some passive play elements with these 3 swing sets. And every time we go to the plaza, someone is in at least one of the swing sets. And then we introduced the shipping container. So when it's closed, it's just a place for storage, and it holds all these various elements that are scattered throughout the plaza. But when we open it up, it can be used for a variety of purposes. It could be a pop-up coffee shop. It could be a restaurant. It could gather people for the census. During COVID-19, it's been used to hand out food. It's a little free library. So it's become a variety of different things, just, whatever its need may be. So the goal for this whole thing was to keep it up for a year, to do a ton of programming and kind of measure the impact. Unfortunately, we'll talk about this in a minute, but that hasn't happened quite as we thought it would. But this is an on-the-ground view. Those planters that you see on the right-hand side, those were all done with the CNC router and manufactured by our team. Same with the swing sets and the different elements that were in this space. We have done more with shipping containers as well. We created a better block in the box. So all the elements that you could possibly need for a placemaking event are inside it. Then we can ship it to whomever. They can pull out the elements, set them up with volunteers in about 2 hours, have their event, and then take it all down, put it back in, and ship it off. We're creating some now that are a little more customized to what people may need it for. For example, we did one for an organization called the Trust for Public Land, and they needed theirs to pop up in parks and be kind of a setting for students. So we made the windows lower. We created some elements that are like whiteboards and different things like that, but just some things that were a little more specific to their needs. But then, of course, COVID-19 hit. And our work, which is all about gathering people in public spaces, wasn't the most appropriate thing to be doing. And so we took a couple days and started thinking about, what are we going to do? What does this look like? How can we help? And we saw that people were creating face shields with 3D printers. We have a 3D printer. We tested it out. It took us about 3 hours to create a visor. We quickly learned that that visor could be done with our CNC router, and we could do 88 in a third of the time it took us to do that one. So we transitioned to creating face shields. We open sourced, we worked off a design from a group out of Portland. We made some tweaks. Some other folks made some tweaks. We put it all together, and we open sourced the visor design. And people all around the world were downloading it, asking us questions, and making their own visors. In the end, we produced about 10,500 visors, and we're able to hand those out to folks in the area. And I don't know how many were produced around the world, but it was kind of interesting to see that happening. Once we kind of wrapped up that project, we started looking at the small businesses who had been impacted and the different ways in which we could help support them. So, you know, we don't have a ton of bodegas in our part of the world. That concept isn't terribly well known. And so we wanted to introduce that a little bit more. Our founding director, besides owning Better Block, he also owns a restaurant and a jazz hall and an outdoor shop. So at his restaurant, we took some of the shelving units that we have on our WikiBlock library, and instead of using the produce that he would normally use for his restaurant, he put it out and sold it wholesale. So that people who were uncomfortable going into big grocery stores and things like that, they could come here. It was open air, and they felt a little bit safer shopping from this kind of space. And then we started talking about parklets and how can we use parklets to extend the space and still promote social distancing and allow people to, the restaurants to open up but still be safe. We've been talking about parklets for 10 years, and I don't know why, but I mean, it's taken off now and people are paying attention to it. So the city of Dallas actually has been working on a parklet program for 6 years, hasn't been able to get it off the ground. We did this in about 2 days, and you know, technically didn't have the permit, but it's kind of what we do is bring the concept to life and kind of push it through and say, like, hey, we need to be looking at this and we need to make these things a little bit easier for folks. And so the city ended up doing a temporary parklet program that is now up and running, and they're looking at kind of streamlining the more permanent approach. We also did these market kiosks as well, so that people could put their merchandise outside and not have to have people coming inside or be in tight spaces. We did guides around this stuff so that people could kind of so we could streamline it and make it a little bit easier for everyone. And then, of course, the open streets movement, we started looking at that and seeing how different people were doing it in different ways. You know, we tried to do one here in Dallas. We picked a specific street. We got annihilated on Facebook. People did not like the concept. It was very poorly received. And we quickly, within about a day, said, all right, we won't do it. But then I started working with Kansas City, Missouri. They did a really smart approach where they did a big network where they shut down big sections of streets, but then they also did where neighborhoods could apply for their own permit to do an open street just one block at a time. So we worked with them and the scooter company Spin, and we created some materials so that they can make their program a little bit better and enhance their street. We also did a guide kind of explaining what that would look like. That went really well. I took our lessons learned from that and from getting beat up on Facebook and rethought the approach that we could take in Dallas. And we did Dallas's slow street program, same kind of concept where we were allowing 10 neighborhoods to sign up for a permit. It's 30 days. We supply all the materials, and we just let people shut down the street to through traffic, but still allow local traffic, merchandise, local traffic, city services, things like that to come through. And we officially handed out our 8th permit this morning. And I think I'm getting calls about the 9th one right now. And so it's been really great. It's very simple. It's just basically 2 barricades on either side. It seems like nothing, but the feedback we've received so far, people are like, cars are going around. When they do come through, they're going slowly. So it seems to be effective, but we're only a couple weeks in, so we'll see how that continues to go. And these are some of our neighbors that have put that up. So the reason we do what we do, we believe in creating spaces with people, and we have seen an impact. So in 65% of our projects, we have seen vacant buildings have been developed with new shops moving in. We've seen 47% have seen new businesses come into a space, which is huge because we always want to support the local businesses and help the small business owners kind of take that next step and get into a brick and mortar. 77% have seen an increase in community engagement. A third of our road diets have been implemented, and 5 community development corporations have formed as well. But we also do it for love. One of the first questions we get is, well, if I put something beautiful out there, what's going to happen to it? Like someone's going to come out and destroy it. I'd say 9 times out of 10, that does not happen. And so we build for love, not for fear. We build for the community who's there and not the what ifs that we all come up with in our heads. And most of the time that ends up working out. I sometimes joke that we do build for Instagram. We know that by creating beautiful spaces, people want to show this off, and people should be proud of their neighborhood. So we want to create spaces where they can be proudful of it. And we build for hope. So this picture was taken, I think, 2 years ago. I was actually sitting in this space with a volunteer, and I had been sick for a little while, and it had taken about 2.5 years to get a diagnosis. And I had received my diagnosis literally 1 week before this picture was taken. So I was sitting there talking with this volunteer. We were just talking through things, and she brought up how she had some health issues. And she told me that when she was 32, which was the age I was at the time, she was diagnosed with this rare autoimmune disease called dermatomyositis. And my jaw dropped. That was what I had just been diagnosed with. And I knew very little about that disease, but the only thing I knew is that there were 9.87 cases out of 1 million people. And somehow this woman and I were sitting in Dallas, Texas, in a park, on a parklet, talking about how we both had it. And that's when it kind of brought home to me what our work is about. We want to bring people together so that they can have conversations, and who knows where those conversations can go. But for me, in my case, it provided just a little bit of hope. And I believe that through these conversations, we can make the world just a little bit better. And that is what we do at the Better Block.